Alright, in this video I'm going to show you how to calculate z-scores in a data set. In this we're going to need to learn two new things. One is how to be cautious using parentheses in Excel calculations, and the other is something called an absolute cell reference. We'll learn both of those in the context of teaching a z-score, but remember that a z-score is simply a way of describing in a data set how many standard deviations above or below average a particular data point is. Now this is a useful reference point because if we can describe, in this example, I have one class where I have some pseudo exam scores. I promise these aren't anyone's actual exam scores. But what I could do is, suppose I was wondering if one class did much better than another, or if one student would be much better in one class than another, I could ask, how many standard deviations is this person above the average, and then compare that to where they might fall in another class. Z-scores are a great way of making comparisons between two data sets because it can account for the fact that in some data sets the data may be more spread out or less spread out or have a higher average or lower average, because what we're doing is we are comparing that data set. We are comparing a single data point in a data set to its position relative to the average in that particular data set. So they're a very useful concept, and we'll talk about them more, particularly in chapters 7, 8, and the rest of the text after that. But for the time being, what I'd like to do is just discuss the formula for it, and then quickly how to calculate it. So the formula for a z-score is the data point, in this case an exam score, minus the average exam score. So we know how many points above average the person is, or below average. But then we're going to divide it by the standard deviation, so that if an individual is really far above average, they may be multiple standard deviations above average. So again, it's the data point minus the average divided by the standard deviation. So we should know right away that we're going to need to calculate the mean and the standard deviation, and so I'm going to do this with a named range again. I'm going to highlight my data, which is B2 to B35, and I'm going to call these exams. Then under mean, I can simply type average of exams. And I'll find out that the average score in this data set is a 70.54. For standard deviation here, we're just going to assume that this is the entire population of exam scores, and that means we can type equals stdev.p of exams. Excuse me. Notice I typed an error in this cell. This just happened to work out, but because the word EXA is not something that Excel recognizes, if I'm not careful here and type the whole word exams, Excel is going to give me an error. Notice that the standard deviation here is about 4 points. So if somebody had approximately a 74, they would be about one standard deviation above average. That's all a z-score is going to tell us here. So in order to calculate the z-score, I'm going to type in this formula, and to do it, I'm going to have to actually type this in. I'm going to say equals, and I'm going to put a left parenthesis here, because we're going to need to use a fraction, and using those parentheses for the numerator of a fraction guarantees that when we do our division, we remember the order of operations that Excel is going to execute. And so by putting things in parentheses, we're telling Excel, do this step first, then go ahead and do the division step later. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, Excel, I want you to use what's in cell B2, and I'm going to ask you to subtract from it what's in cell F7. Okay, now that says a data point minus the average divided by what's in cell F8, which is the standard deviation. So a score of a 68.21 is just about a half a standard deviation below average. Now, as we've seen before, Excel is going to allow us to click and drag on functions to continue a pattern down. So if I were to click and drag this down, what I'll show you quickly here, notice that in the cell C2 we see the number, but in the formula bar we actually see what we typed, which is B2 minus F7 divided by F8. And if we were to click in here, it's going to highlight those cells for us just to remind us what's happening. If we click and drag this formula down, it says divide by 0. It says you've done something wrong. for whatever reason, the formula we thought we were copying is not going to show up here. The first thing you should do when you see an error like this is go to the formula bar and see what's actually happening. We'll recognize what happened is when we drug this down, it now said take the data point in the cell next to me, which is B3. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. And we want it to subtract the average, which is in F7, and divide it by what's in F8, which is the standard deviation. But when we drug this formula down, it moved all of the cell references down. So the way Excel actually read what we said here in cell C2 is, I want you to take the cell to the left of me. And then I want you to subtract the cell that is 4 rows over and 6 cells down from this value. Then I want you to divide that by the cell that is 4 rows over and 7 rows down. So Excel sees this reference relative to the cell we're operating in. So that when we drag it down, it says, I want you to take the cell left to me. I want you to subtract from it the cell that's 4 rows over and 6 rows down. But that's no longer the mean, okay? So Excel is doing exactly what we told it to do. We just told it the wrong way of doing it. There are ways of keeping those cell references exactly the same, and they're and we're going to learn how to do that right now. It's actually really quite easy. All we need to do is click on the cell we were interested in and put a $sign in front of whatever it was you want to hold constant. So for example, since we're only moving up and down, the only thing that could happen here is Excel could move our row 1 further down. So if we put a $sign in front of the 7, Excel knows we want you to keep this row exactly at F7. So when you go over 4 rows from where I'm telling you, make sure that you're not taking the cell 6 down from it, you're taking the one exactly in the 7th cell. Another way of doing this is if you hit the F4 key, you can toggle through the different combinations of these cells. Okay, we can freeze the row or the column or both. So for safety here, one of the easiest things to do is to freeze them both, but that may have unintended consequences. So be mindful that what we've told it now is we want you to take what's in cell F7 and F8, which are our mean and standard deviation. Another way of doing this is we could, of course, name this mean using our named range function and name cell F8 standard deviation, and then when we typed in this formula, it would execute exactly. All right, so now that I've typed this in with these absolute cell references here using the $sign, when I drag it down now, notice that it now says take the cell left of me, subtract from it cell F7, and divide both of them by cell F8. Okay, this is exactly the formula for a z-score. Now I can continue to click and drag this down and it'll fill that in for me. Another thing I can do here is I can actually look at this little box in the corner, and if I move my cursor until there's a series of crosshairs right over that box and double click, it'll fill that all the way down until there is a missing cell below and adjacent to it. Okay, so when this formula has nowhere left to go, it stops. Now we have here the z-scores for each one of our exam scores, so that what we can see is for this individual, they were 2 standard deviations below average, or 1.99 standard deviations below average. This individual was they were 0.92 standard deviations above average, okay, or their z-score was 0.92. This should give you an idea of how important it is to be careful with both parentheses and absolute cell references and make you comfortable with z-scores, and you'll have more opportunities to practice this on your